The confetti hadn't even settled on the cake table when my mother-in-law lifted her champagne glass, turned to my sister with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said the 6 words that split my life into a before and an after. "Tell her about the birthday, Maya." That was all. 6 words, spoken lightly enough to sound almost like a toast, except nothing about the way the room went still afterward felt like a celebration. I was standing by the dessert table holding a fork I never got to use, watching my sister's face drain of color in real time, the way water leaves a glass when you tip it too fast. My husband, Daniel, was 2 feet away from me, close enough that I could feel him go rigid without even looking at him directly. I didn't need to look. I could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm actually breaks. I set the fork down slowly, careful not to let it clink against the plate, because some old instinct in me already understood that whatever came next, I was going to need my hands steady and my voice steadier. "What birthday, Diane?" I asked, and my own voice came out flatter and calmer than I expected, almost like it belonged to someone else, someone who had already guessed the shape of the answer and was simply waiting, out of formality, to hear it said out loud. My sister Maya didn't answer right away. She looked at Daniel first, not at me, and that alone told me more than any sentence could have. I have spent my entire adult life being the person people come to when something falls apart, the one who stays composed while everyone else unravels, and in that single unbearable pause, standing under string lights in my mother-in-law's backyard, I felt every part of that instinct rise up at once, cold, focused, and completely without panic. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached over, picked my purse up off the back of my chair, and stood there holding it against my hip like a woman preparing to leave a meeting. Rather than a woman whose entire marriage had just cracked open in front of 30 relatives holding paper plates. Diane's smile finally faltered, as if she was only now realizing that the silence she'd broken wasn't going to fill itself back in the comfortable way she'd expected. "Someone needs to tell her," she said quietly, mostly to Daniel now, "before I have to say it myself." And in that moment, watching my husband's jaw tighten and my sister's eyes fill with tears she clearly hadn't planned on shedding in public, I understood something with total, bone-deep clarity. Whatever secret 4 years had been built around, it wasn't going to stay buried one more minute. And for reasons I still don't fully understand, some steady, unshaken part of me had already started preparing for exactly this moment long before I consciously knew it was coming. My name is Sarah Whitfield. I'm 39 years old, and for the past 14 years, I've worked as a pediatric nurse at a regional hospital just outside Sacramento, California. It's the kind of job that teaches you things no textbook ever could, mostly about how people behave when the ground shifts beneath them without warning. I've held the hands of parents receiving the worst news of their lives, and I've watched, over and over, how the body responds before the mind catches up, the stillness, the too calm voice, the strange clarity that settles in right before the grief does. I never imagined I would need that same clinical composure standing in a backyard holding a fork, watching my own family rearrange itself in front of me. Growing up, I was always the responsible one, the one who remembered birthdays and doctor's appointments and who quietly held things together while everyone else fell apart around me. My sister Maya, 3 years younger, was the opposite. She was the dreamer, the one who cried during commercials, the one I bailed out of a dozen small disasters throughout our 20s without a second thought, because that's simply what older sisters do. When our father passed away 5 years ago, Maya moved into my guest room for almost 3 months because she couldn't bear being alone with her grief, and I made her coffee every single morning, sat with her through the nights when the sadness came in waves too heavy to carry by herself. I have spent my whole life being the sturdy one, the dependable one, and somewhere buried inside that identity, I think I stopped imagining that Maya was even capable of keeping something from me, let alone something as enormous and quietly devastating as whatever Diane had just referenced in front of 30 stunned relatives. Daniel and I had been married for 11 years by that point, long enough that I thought I understood the full architecture of our life together, the routines, the inside jokes, the small rhythms that make a marriage feel solid rather than fragile. Looking back now, I realize how much of what I believed was solid had actually been built on things I simply hadn't been told. Standing there under those string lights, gripping my purse a little too tightly, I felt something cold settle low in my stomach, a recognition I couldn't yet name but somehow already understood on some primal, wordless level. Whatever this birthday was that Diane wanted spoken aloud, it had nothing to do with cake or candles. It had everything to do with a version of my own life I had never once been allowed to see clearly, hiding in plain sight for years while I stood beside it, entirely unaware. Daniel finally spoke, and his voice came out lower than I'd ever heard it, the particular low register of a man choosing his next words with the kind of extreme, deliberate care that itself becomes a confession. "Sarah, can we talk about this at home?" Not a question. A request dressed up as one, the way people phrase things when what they actually want is more time, not more honesty. I looked at him for a long moment, at the man I had built 11 years of mornings and holidays and quiet Sunday afternoons with, and I felt something shift permanently in how I saw his face, the same familiar features suddenly holding a stranger's expression underneath them. "No," I said, and I surprised myself with how even the word came out. "We're going to talk about it right now." Diane set her champagne glass down on the table with a small, deliberate click, the sound of a woman who had decided, after however many years of silence, that she was finally finished protecting other people's comfort at the expense of her own conscience. "4 years ago," she said, looking directly at me now, "on Maya's birthday. The weekend you were at that nursing conference in Phoenix." My stomach dropped before she even finished the sentence, because I remembered that weekend clearly, remembered calling Daniel from my hotel room every night, remembered him telling me he'd taken Maya out for a quiet dinner since I couldn't be there to celebrate with her myself, remembered feeling grateful, genuinely grateful, that my husband and my sister got along well enough to spend an evening together without me. I had told that story to friends over the years as a small, sweet example of how close our little makeshift family was. I had never once imagined it was actually the origin point of something I was only now, 4 years later, finally being allowed to see. Maya's hands were shaking. She set down her own glass, and when she finally looked at me, her eyes were full in a way that told me she had rehearsed this confession 100 times in her head over 4 years and still hadn't found a version of it that didn't sound exactly as terrible as it actually was. "It was one night," she said, her voice cracking on the word one, as though the number itself might somehow soften what came after it. "It was a mistake, Sarah. It was the worst mistake of my entire life, and I have hated myself every single day since." I stood completely still, absorbing the shape of what she was telling me before she'd even finished telling me all of it, because some quiet, disciplined part of my mind had already started doing what it always does under pressure. Cataloging. Sequencing. Refusing to let the first wave of shock make a single decision on my behalf before I understood the entire truth. I didn't ask the question everyone standing around that dessert table was clearly bracing for. I didn't demand details, didn't raise my voice, didn't do any of the things I imagined 30 relatives were quietly expecting a betrayed wife to do in a backyard full of witnesses. Instead, I asked the only question that actually mattered to me in that moment, the one question whose answer would tell me exactly how large this secret truly was. "Is there a child?" The words came out of me before I'd even fully decided to ask them, and the silence that followed lasted just long enough to answer the question on its own, before either of them found the courage to say it out loud. Maya closed her eyes. Daniel looked down at the grass beneath his feet, and in the space of that single unbearable pause, I understood that whatever I thought I had walked into this backyard believing about my life, I had actually been living inside a much smaller, much more carefully managed version of the truth for 4 entire years. "His name is Leo," Maya finally whispered. "He just turned 4. That's why Diane said birthday. 4 years old. The same age as the boy I had watched running across 3 separate family gatherings over the past several years, a boy I had always been told belonged to a man named Chris, a coworker Maya had briefly dated around that same time, a boy whose dark, serious eyes I had once complimented at a 4th of July barbecue without ever once suspecting they belonged to my own husband. I felt the ground tilt slightly beneath me, not dramatically, not the way it does in movies, but in that quiet, internal way that only the person experiencing it can actually feel, a private earthquake happening entirely beneath a perfectly still surface. Diane, to her credit or perhaps simply out of exhaustion, finally softened her voice. "I found out 8 months ago," she said. "I've been carrying it since, watching all of you pretend everything was fine at every single holiday. And I couldn't do it anymore, Sarah. I couldn't sit through one more dinner watching you compliment a child you didn't know was your husband's son. 8 months. Diane had known for 8 months, had sat across from me at Thanksgiving, at Christmas, at Easter, carrying this entire secret silently while I passed the mashed potatoes and asked Maya how work was going, completely unaware that the woman across the table had been quietly deciding, meal by meal, exactly how much longer she was willing to protect two people who had never once extended her the same courtesy of honesty. I didn't stay for the rest of the party. I set my purse strap over my shoulder, thanked Diane for her honesty in a voice so calm it seemed to unsettle her more than any scream could have, and walked to my car without looking back at either Maya or Daniel, though I could feel both of them watching me the entire distance across that lawn. Daniel caught up to me before I reached the driver's door, his hand landing lightly on the roof of my car as if he could physically prevent me from leaving simply by standing close enough. "Sarah, please, let me explain everything, all of it, right now." I looked at him for a long moment, at the particular desperation in his face, the specific kind that only appears once a person realizes the story they've been managing for years has finally slipped entirely out of their control. "You've had 4 years to explain it," I said quietly. "I think I've earned the right to hear the rest of it on my own timeline instead of yours." I got in the car. I didn't slam the door. I simply pulled it shut with a steadiness that surprised even me, started the engine, and drove home through streets I'd driven 1,000 times before, streets that suddenly looked slightly unfamiliar, the way anything does once you understand the life happening inside it was never quite what you believed. I didn't cry on that drive. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect tears in moments like this, and mine simply didn't come, not yet. What came instead was a kind of clarity I recognized from work, the particular focus that arrives right after the initial shock of bad news, when the emotional part of your brain steps back just long enough to let the practical part take over completely. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I had already decided I wasn't going to confront Daniel with raw emotion. I was going to do what I have always done best, quietly, methodically, and completely on my own terms. I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop, and began doing the only thing that has ever steadied me during moments that threatened to knock me flat. I started building a timeline. The Phoenix conference dates. The dinner Daniel claimed to have taken Maya to. The birth announcement Maya had posted online 4 years ago, one I now pulled up again, this time reading the comments beneath it with entirely new eyes, noticing for the first time how carefully worded certain messages had been, how many people, apparently, had quietly known something I never had. Somewhere around midnight, staring at a screen full of dates and photographs and small, previously invisible inconsistencies, I understood that this wasn't going to be a single conversation that resolved everything by morning. This was going to require exactly the kind of patient, unglamorous investigation I had spent 14 years learning to do professionally, except this time, the patient chart I was building belonged to my own life. By 2 in the morning, I had built out a timeline. Stretching back nearly 5 years, cross-referencing photographs, captions, and dates against my own memory of that period, and what emerged wasn't one isolated mistake contained neatly inside a single weekend in Phoenix. It was a pattern, quiet and sustained, hiding in plain sight behind ordinary family photographs I had scrolled past 100 times without ever once looking closely enough. There was a picture from Leo's first birthday, Daniel standing slightly too close behind Maya in the background, a detail I had never registered before because I had no reason to be looking for it. There was a text exchange, accidentally still open on our shared family calendar app, scheduling a pediatrician appointment that Daniel had apparently attended under the explanation, given to me at the time, that he was simply helping Maya out while she was between jobs and short on childcare. I sat in the blue glow of my laptop screen piecing together 4 years of small, previously meaningless details, watching them rearrange themselves into a shape I could no longer unsee once I understood what I was actually looking at. I am not someone who breaks easily, and I want to say clearly that what I felt in that kitchen wasn't rage, not yet. It was something colder and more exacting than anger, the particular sensation of watching your entire understanding of your own life quietly restructure itself around a truth you were never given permission to know. I thought about every family dinner where Leo had been present, every time I had asked Maya innocent questions about Chris, the man she'd told me was his father, questions she had answered smoothly, easily, without a single visible crack in the story. I thought about Daniel, sitting beside me at those same dinners, passing serving dishes, laughing at jokes, occupying the exact same emotional space as always while carrying a secret this enormous directly beside me the entire time. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, I found the detail that finally made the entire timeline collapse into absolute certainty. A single photograph, buried in an old shared cloud folder neither of them had apparently remembered still existed, time-stamped 9 months before Leo's birth, showing Daniel and Maya together at what was unmistakably a hospital, the caption beneath it reading only, ultrasound day. 9 months before Leo's birth. Long before Phoenix. Long before the version of the story Diane had introduced in that backyard, the version that made it sound like a single unfortunate weekend rather than what the evidence in front of me was now undeniably suggesting, something that had begun earlier, and possibly lasted longer, than anyone standing at that party had been willing to admit out loud. I closed the laptop slowly, my hands steady in a way that almost frightened me, and I understood, with total and complete clarity, that tomorrow morning I wasn't simply going to have a difficult conversation with my husband. I was going to need every ounce of the discipline 14 years of nursing had taught me, because whatever I confronted him with was going to require more than raised voices. It was going to require proof he couldn't talk his way around. I didn't sleep. Around 6 in the morning, I heard Daniel's key in the front door, quiet, hesitant, the sound of a man testing whether the house he was entering still belonged to him in any meaningful way. I was already sitting at the kitchen table when he walked in, laptop closed in front of me, hands folded, the exact posture I use with families in the hospital right before delivering news I know is going to change the entire shape of their week. He stopped in the doorway when he saw me. "You've been up all night," he said, which wasn't a question, and which also wasn't the sentence either of us actually needed spoken first. "I found the ultrasound photo," I said quietly, and I watched every last trace of color drain from his face in real time. The particular collapse of a man who has just realized the story he spent the drive home rehearsing has already been rendered obsolete before he even opened his mouth. He sat down slowly across from me, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. "It started before Phoenix," I finally said, not as a question, because I already knew the answer, but because I needed to hear him confirm it out loud, needed him to be the one to finally say the true version instead of letting me carry the entire weight of discovering it alone. He nodded, barely, his eyes fixed on the table between us. "About 2 months before," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't supposed to become anything. And then Maya found out she was pregnant, and I panicked, and by the time I had any real chance to tell you the truth, Leo already existed, and I convinced myself that telling you would only destroy something that felt, by then, impossible to undo without destroying everyone in it." I let him finish completely before I said anything else, because I have learned, across 14 years of difficult conversations, that people rarely lie efficiently once they've decided to stop. The longer you let them keep talking, the more the story reveals its own soft, unrehearsed places, the spots where careful preparation gives way to something closer to the truth. "For years, Daniel," I said quietly. "For years of dinners, of holidays, of me holding that little boy and telling him how much he looked like his mother's side of the family." My voice didn't rise. I didn't need it to. The weight of the sentence carried its own force without any help from volume. He didn't try to defend himself further. He simply sat there, shoulders curved forward, finally understanding, I think, for the very first time, the true scale of what 4 years of careful silence had actually cost, not just for me, but for a 4-year-old boy who had never once been given any say in the secret his entire existence had been quietly built around. 2 weeks later, I sat across from a family attorney named Renee Castillo, a folder of my own evidence spread across her desk, the timeline, the photographs, the pediatrician records I had since confirmed through a colleague at work who owed me a favor and asked no questions I wasn't ready to answer. Renee read through everything carefully, without interrupting, the particular quiet of someone who has seen enough cases like mine to know that letting the evidence speak first is always more useful than reacting to it out loud. When she finally looked up, she asked me the same question I imagine she asks everyone who walks through her door carrying a folder this thick. "What do you actually want out of this, Sarah? Not what you're angry about. What you want." I thought about it honestly before answering, because I had spent 2 weeks turning that exact question over in my own mind without landing on a single, clean answer. I want the truth to stop being something other people get to control, I finally said. I want to know everything, completely, before I decide what happens next. She nodded, the nod of someone who has heard versions of that sentence many times and has learned to respect the particular strength it takes to say it out loud rather than simply reacting on instinct. Over the following weeks, with her guidance, I learned things I hadn't expected, that Daniel had been quietly contributing to expenses connected to Leo for years, routed through vague categories in our shared accounts I had simply never had reason to question, that paternity had never been formally established anywhere, meaning that legally, on paper, Leo still belonged entirely to a man named Chris who had unknowingly been raising, at least in official terms, a child that wasn't biologically his at all. That detail complicated everything, because it meant this wasn't only a story about what Daniel and Maya had taken from me. It was also, quietly and unavoidably, a story about a 4-year-old boy who deserved better than 4 adults managing their own comfort at the direct expense of his eventually learning the truth in the worst, most public way possible, exactly the way I had. I decided, with Renee's counsel, to move forward not out of anger, but out of a steady, deliberate need to finally see this entire situation handled honestly, for everyone involved, including the one person in this story who had never once been given any choice in any part of it at all. The divorce proceedings moved faster than I expected once the evidence was fully assembled, mostly because Daniel, to whatever small credit remained available to him at that point, chose not to contest any of it. He signed what needed to be signed, answered what needed to be answered, and for the first time since that backyard, seemed genuinely more concerned with doing right by Leo than with managing how the story reflected on him personally. Maya and I didn't speak for almost 4 months. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a temptation, once enough time has passed, to smooth over how long real anger actually takes to soften into something more survivable. When we finally did talk, it wasn't in a dramatic confrontation, just a quiet conversation over coffee at a place neither of us had any history with, neutral ground for 2 people trying to figure out what, if anything, could still exist between them after something this large had passed between us. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said, turning her cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. I just needed you to know that not telling you wasn't protecting you. It was protecting me. I understand that now, and I hate that it took losing you to see it clearly. I didn't offer forgiveness that day, because I didn't have it yet, and I have learned enough, both professionally and now personally, to know that manufacturing forgiveness before you actually feel it only delays the real version from eventually arriving. What I did offer was honesty, the same honesty I had been denied for 4 years. I told her I still loved Leo, that none of what happened was his fault, that I wasn't willing to let a 4-year-old lose an aunt because the adults around him had made choices he never had any part in. Slowly, carefully, over the months that followed, Maya and I began rebuilding something, not the same relationship we'd had before, that version was gone permanently, but a new one, built on considerably more honesty than the one it replaced. Diane and I, strangely, grew closer during that same period, both of us having independently learned the same difficult lesson about what silence eventually costs everyone involved once it finally breaks. Chris, once he learned the truth through the paternity proceedings, took it better than any of us expected, choosing, in the end, to remain in Leo's life as the father he had already been raising him to be, regardless of biology, a decision that quietly impressed me more than almost anything else that happened during those difficult months. I moved into my own apartment 8 months after that backyard party, a small 2-bedroom close to the hospital, with a kitchen table I bought new specifically because I wanted at least one surface in my life that had never held a single lie across it. The divorce finalized quietly on an ordinary Tuesday morning, no dramatic courtroom scene, just signatures and paperwork in a strange, settled kind of peace that arrived slower than I expected but arrived completely once it finally did. I still see Leo. Every other weekend, I pick him up from Maya's, and we spend the afternoon at the small park near my new apartment, where he insists, every single time, that I push him on the swings until my arms genuinely ache, laughing in that pure, uncomplicated way only a 5-year-old who has no idea what his existence once cost the adults around him can laugh. He doesn't know the full story yet, and someday, when he's old enough, I hope the people who love him find a way to tell him honestly, without protecting themselves at the expense of protecting him, the way I wasn't protected for 4 long years. Daniel and I speak occasionally now, mostly about logistics, birthdays, holidays, the small mechanical details that still connect two people who once built an entire life together even after that life has fundamentally changed shape. There's no anger left in those conversations anymore, just a kind of tired, mutual respect between two people who finally, eventually, told each other the whole truth, even if it arrived years later than either of us would have chosen. I think about that backyard often, the string lights, the fork I never got to use, the exact 6 words that split my life into a before and an after. And I think about how, somewhere underneath the shock of that night, some steady part of me already knew that whatever came next, I was going to face it clearly, deliberately, and completely on my own terms, the same way I face everything difficult in my life. If you've made it this far with me, I want to know honestly, would you have stayed standing in that backyard demanding answers immediately, or would you have needed the quiet, careful distance I gave myself before confronting the people who hurt you the most? Tell me in the comments exactly where you're watching this from tonight, and if this story reached something real in you, stay close, because there are so many more stories like mine still waiting to be shared, and I would genuinely love to have you here again for the next one.